If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. Today I want to talk about efficiency and some of its enemies. I think we get confused in our thinking a little bit, and there's two concepts really that disguise the challenge that we face when we're looking for efficiency or productivity or even effectiveness, all these things mushed together. And I'll talk about what those things are, but I want to share a mindset with you because I think that if we have the wrong mindset, it leads us to wrong action. The notion of convenience and efficiency, and in some ways, hurried productivity, are all real close cousins. And when we think about it, but convenience, on the one hand, leads to a pretty subtle trap, and I'll explain what that is. But again, we're going back to mindset and we're going back to thinking in different ways about how to solve our problem. So today we'll talk about the engineering mindset and we'll contrast it with kind of pseudo productivity, both in convenience and hurry. And I'll give you a mental model to organize all this stuff. When I talk to people about attention compass and about ways to improve their productivity in the long term, I often hear, well, I'm too busy for that. And also I'll hear, well, why isn't what I'm doing good enough? And those are legitimate questions, but I do think if we dig deeper into that, we can understand, I think, what's driving those questions. If you talk to my clients, one of the main things that they'll tell you is that attention compass saved me time. And when they say that, they use terms like 20% better. I'm saving 20% of my time. And I don't know that they've actually measured this in any meaningful way, but that feeling is real consistent across my customer base. And so if some coaching can save you time, we tend to say, hey, well, I don't have time for coaching. I don't have time to save time. Now, by the way, if you want to understand a little bit more about attention compass and how it might help you, then I would suggest that you go back and listen to episode 22 of this podcast. Alternately, you can hit me at larry@dobusyright.com. And of course, I'll put my email in the show notes, plus a link to episode 22. And looking into attention compass and how it works may help you understand why it's going to make you more effective. But back to these arguments that I get, people say, well, I'm too busy. And that's always interesting to me because, we I think all get into this challenge. And I'll talk about a personal story where, in point of fact, I'm too busy to solve a problem. And so we'll get into that, but I do want us to think about it a little bit more carefully. So all of this thinking leads to the idea of convenience. It leads to the idea of it should be straightforward and fairly effortless. And the mindset that I want to offer to you here is that efficiency is very seldom effortless. It requires effort, it requires thinking. And we'll use an example here in a minute that talks about why that's true. So when we look at efficiency, we're thinking about, in the engineering world, efficiency is outputs over inputs, and you've probably heard me say this before. So it's the amount of things that get produced per unit of input. And if we want to get more efficient, and I think we all do, because our goal is to increase our output or reduce our input, then we need to utilize this equation to help us think about that. So if we want to increase output, an engineering solution to increasing output is to make sure that you're holding the inputs constant. Because if output increase, but inputs increase as well, then you're not actually gaining efficiency. You're gaining more output, true, but you're not gaining efficiency. And the flip side of that is, if you're reducing inputs, you have to hold the outputs constant. Because if decreasing inputs also decreases the outputs, then you haven't gained efficiency. But I think when we look at convenience, and I'll talk about this, and I'm going to say hurry, I'm going to say product focus, I'm going to say this hard focus on output, I think those things can distract us from the real problem that we're facing and confuse us. So when we look at convenience as convenience, I'll say it tends to minimize the inputs and ignore the outputs. And I think this is dangerous as a sole focus. We think about, okay, well, what's the easiest way to get this done? And we think that we're learning to be efficient by focusing on the easiest way to get something done. And certainly, if that something done stays constant and we're reducing the inputs on that, then we are gaining efficiency. But efficiency is always about the ratio of the two things. So convenience, in my mind, tends to overemphasize reducing the inputs. So if you think about things that are convenient in our world, typically the output is less than what we could produce if we invested more time. So convenience food, fast food. Some fast food is pretty good. None of it's as good as what gets cooked in my kitchen. So when we look at convenience, we tend to be willing to sacrifice something about the output as a trade-off. Now, it's a little bit more complex than that, because sometimes with convenience, we're decreasing one input and trading off for another input. For example, if you do carry out food, DoorDash, or whatever is happening there, then you might get it from a very good restaurant, but it's going to cost you a lot more than it could through other mechanisms of getting that food. You follow? And so, we convenience, we go to the drive-through at fast food, and everybody knows that the accuracy of orders at the drive-through is somewhat suspect. Now, this is highlighted in my own world because my daughter is a magnet for bad drive-through service. It has gotten to be a family joke at this point, because the four of us on the way home from church when the kids were younger, we'd stop off and grab a burger or whatever. And we know we're sacrificing quality to get convenience, but that's the deal that we've made. And we would order 4 meals, and 3 of them would be right, and 1 of them would be wrong. And if one was wrong, it was always my daughter's that was wrong. And I don't know how this worked out or why or whatever. We thought some about the complexity of her order and some of these different things, but that's really not germane, just kind of a funny story. But we do face that decrease in absolute output when we utilize convenience. Now, sometimes that's the right thing to do, and other times it may not be. So this is wisdom here that we're trying to think about, and the mindset that we're trying to put in place. So if we put convenience at one end of the spectrum, then I would say the other end of the spectrum is this hurry, this busyness culture, this frantic activity that we engage in. And I'll get to Cal Newport in a minute, but he talks about the hive mind and this sense of drivenness that we all have, that we have to touch the plates and spin the plates. And I think that's the other end of some spectrum from this kind of convenience. But if we focus exclusively on inputs, then that's not an efficiency argument either, because efficiency in engineering is only when we hold the outputs constant, or when we're watching both sides of the equation. So if we increase our inputs, are we watching to make sure that our outputs also increase? Or are we just thrashing around in hopes that our increased input, our increased busyness will produce greater output? And again, increasing the inputs should increase the outputs given a engineered system. So these are not bad things, particularly. Convenience is not a bad thing, neither is sometimes you have to be in a hurry. But if we let that colonize our brains, if you will, if we're always thinking in terms of one or the other, then that can interfere with our pursuit of efficiency. And I see this a fair amount with people that I talk to about attention compass. In my mind, people want me to think they're productive. So they tend to double down on what they're already doing in order to demonstrate that they're being productive. And this is absolutely human for people to do. And when I'm in meetings, I often get this very, clipped, very tense discussion. People that aren't normally looking at their watch or looking at their watch during these meetings, and they're going, okay, what are we going to do to be efficient? And in my mind, and I may have the wrong read on this altogether, and I get it, and I'm not banging on anybody, but I think we all do this to some degree. If you're like me, you always brush your teeth before you go to the dentist, right? And I'll tidy up the house. If I'm going to get somebody to clean my house, I'll tidy it up before they get here. And so we want to kind of not be that guy, right, or girl. And we want to kind of present a reasonably good picture of ourselves when we're getting help. And I think that's perfectly natural and great. But I think there's this notion of premature efficiency, and this is still a little vague in my mind. And I just mention it here to say that, that's maybe part of this notion of hurry, is this extreme, focus on inputs in an effort to drive greater outputs. The notion of engineered efficiency is really interesting. And here's where we're going to get to the example from Cal Newport. I've been reading rereading actually Cal's book, A World Without Email. And he has some really great ideas in there. I think the title turns a lot of people off. It's not, I think, as successful a book as it should be. I think more people should read it than do. But he uses this great example, and he's talking about Henry Ford. And when we look at Henry Ford, his great innovations are standardized parts to make cars and the assembly line. And these things enabled a huge increase in labor productivity in the very first part of the 20th century. And you probably are familiar with that story. And Cal makes the point, when he tells this story, he makes the point of the history of the development of these ideas. And I say standardized parts and the assembly line because they kind of grew up together. So when Ford kind of came to this idea, the way a car factory worked was that workers went to the car to do their work. So they had the car set up in a place in the shop, and the workers brought the welders and they welded, and they brought the machining tools and they machined. And parts were what? Customized. Parts were tweaked in order to fit in with each other. And all this was craftsmanship at the time, and it was assumed that that was the way to build a car. I mean, that's the way, in many cases, we had always worked, and it's natural for us to work this way. The way we had always worked was to go to the work and do it. Go to the tree to cut it down, and that makes perfect sense. But sometimes the thing that makes perfect sense kind of blinds people to alternatives. So here's Ford. So one of Ford's primary ideas was, well, wait a minute. Why should the workers have to go to the work? Can we bring the work to the workers? Now, we look back from the 21st century, we look back at Ford and we go, well, of course, it makes perfect sense that you would bring the work to the workers and assembly lines, and we understand how this works. And of course, you'd do it this way. But at the time, it was much less than obvious that this was the right way to do something. And there wasn't a ready-made solution to moving the work to the workers. I don't know how much a Model T weighs, but you can't put it in your pocket and carry it around. So, hey, let's move the people. They move themselves and they're much lighter than a car, right? And so obviously, right, this was the I guess, so it's patently obvious that the workers need to move and the car needs to sit still. But Ford rethought that, and as he was rethinking it, he had to engineer this stuff. Okay, he had to build an assembly line largely from scratch. Now, Ford was not the only person thinking about this stuff, and there were other factories that moved things to the workers. Apparently, Ford was at least potentially inspired by the way other processes worked. But it really was an innovation for the automobile industry, and so he had to engineer these parts. Both the assembly line itself, the thing that moves the work, and then he also had to invent, or cause to be invented, tools to make standardized parts, neither of which is a trivial engineering exercise. I'm constantly fascinated by the people, industrial engineers, who can make a machine that can wrap a piece of candy that's 1 inch square and 1/2 an inch thick. They wrap it in cellophane and it stays wrapped. And there's a machine that does that. I'm constantly fascinated by these ideas. But there's no reason to believe, and history shows that it's not true, there's no reason to believe that Ford just said, okay, hey, everybody, take the weekend off. And while you're gone, I'm going to install this assembly line. And then Monday you can come back and I'll show you the new way to work. It was trial and error. It was the beta test of the assembly line, and it broke a lot. And how do you build this thing? And Ford's got his people yelling at him. It's like, hey, I can't do my work because the car's not here. Let's go back to the old way. He's got investors and people who are going, hey, you're spending a lot of money building these tools. We expect you to spend money to build cars. And he's got a lot of folks that are really questioning what's going on. But he had this vision and he engineered that solution. And it worked out in the long term to be much more efficient. He reduced the labor time of producing a Model T by something like 70%. And the key for us, the takeaway for us is that this had effort involved in it. This was not straightforward. It was not easy. It was not convenient to gain efficiency. And I think and here's the mindset, I think if we focus on convenience, then we're losing the tendency to engineer solutions. And I get it. We have learned that convenience is good. We have learned labor-saving devices, and this is part of the lesson that Ford taught us is, hey, let's get some labor-saving devices. And that's great. But if we look at a situation and go, well, it's going to be inconvenient to fix it, that's true. And so we've got to think longer term, and we've got to think about, okay, well, is it worth the effort? What am I going to get going forward? And this is this engineering mindset that I'm contrasting with a convenience mindset on the one hand, and with the hurry mindset on the other hand. The hurry mindset is, I don't have time to look into this situation and fix it. I've got to be moving. And then the convenience side is some sort of complacency, some sort of, well, it's easier this way, so I'm not even going to look into it. Well, our work might not be easy. And the point of our work is not that it be particularly easy, but that it be efficient. And so that's this engineering mindset, this longer term mindset. And that's the one that I want to highlight in our conversation today, is that little bit longer term mindset. So I've talked about convenience being an enemy of this mindset, and I've talked about hurry being an enemy of this mindset. And there's another one, and that is the notion of the J curve. The J curve tells us that change has a cost. Okay. And people, rightly so, right? People say, when they face a change, people say, well, it's going to get worse before it gets better. And that's as good a description of the J curve as any. And, if you think back about Ford and his assembly line, I mean, they had a process for getting these cars built. And I'm sure that productivity went down as people moved to the new way of production. And as there were, in modern terms, there were bugs in his system. And those things had to be fixed, and then people could get on with their work. And the early examples broke a lot. And, some of the parts that he was using that we now treat as very reliable were less reliable. When he was doing this, electricity was probably not terribly reliable. And they were switching from steam-driven machinery to electric motor-driven pieces and parts. And so a lot of these things were just up in the air. And he had the vision to engineer his way through all of these challenges. So if we go back to the spectrum and we say, okay, convenience is at one end. It's not a bad thing. It's at one end. And hurry is at the other end, this intense focus on more and more input. Then I would say efficiency, engineered efficiency, is somewhere in the middle. And as such, it's got to be something that's in our minds, and we've got to get to it with our eyes open. And that's this J curve problem. So I'll give you an example of the J curve. So let's talk about healthcare, for example. So if your knee is hurting you, you go to the doctor and the doctor says, hey, you need surgery. Okay, well, you go there because you have pain. And the result of your efforts is you want to have less pain. But to get from here to there, the doctor is going to have to put you through quite a lot of pain. Now, they've got drugs and anesthetic and those sorts of things, but there's going to be a fair amount of pain in most cases. And medicine's getting better at this, and I don't want to just bang on doctors. But it's true that your level of pain is at level A, and during and immediately after the surgery, your level of pain is going to go way up, with the notion that over time, it goes down below the previous level. But that's an example of the J curve. So it happens, and it's a cost of improvement. You've heard people say, change is not free, but you can't get better without change. And so you have to make that investment in the change in order to get to a new plateau, if you will. So we talked about convenience at one end, hurry at the other, and efficiency is in the middle. And that neither one of the two extremes is bad in and of themselves, but they can disguise themselves as productivity. So when we look at real live engineered productivity, we have to look at the equation, outputs over inputs, and we have to take a little bit longer term view, just because the J curve is always there. Sometimes the J curve, the decrease in output is small for a big increase, but it's always there. There are, I think, people who think that the depth of the J curve has something to do with the amount of increase you'll get eventually. I don't know that that's been proven, but it ain't a bad way to think about it. So we've got to have this long-term mindset about our efficiency and about engineered efficiency. The point is, we have to be watching both sides of the equation, and we have to be thoughtful about it. So if I'm trying to decrease my inputs, then I need to be very careful that I'm not also decreasing my outputs. And that's where this engineering mindset comes into play, is to keep an eye on both sides of the equation at all times. So, we've talked about the spectrum, and we've talked about the notion that, convenience and the extreme version of convenience, in my mind, could be characterized as complacency. And now we're into terms that have negative connotation, right? And at the other end, the extreme version of hurry is frantic. The extreme version of hurry is things get broken in this overly hasty attempt at gaining output. And time pressure does a lot of that to us. But at the very extremes, you've got both of these problems. And I would say, based on my experience in the modern workplace, we are a little bit bipolar at the two ends of the spectrum. And we're impatient with the middle of the spectrum. And so taking forward, I think, a couple of ideas here, right? Idea number one is just because it's inconvenient in the short term doesn't mean it's bad in the long term. Long-term good things are often inconvenient in the short term. And we all know this. Working out is inconvenient, but in the long term, okay? Another idea is just because it takes time in the short term doesn't mean it's bad in the long term. And I think both ends of this spectrum, particularly taken to extreme, ignore these ideas. And in some ways, I guess I'm just arguing against a short-term focus. And I'm arguing in favor of taking a longer-term focus and thinking about it carefully. So another way to look at this is if we focus on reducing the inputs, exclusively reducing the inputs, then we're in convenience mode. If we add the step of holding the output constant while we try to reduce the input, then we're in engineering mode. And it takes some more thought and some more invention. At the other end, we want to increase the output. This is the hurry end. We want to increase the output. And this is that busy mindset. But the engineering mindset adds, oh, and hold the inputs constant. So we're going to problem solve against this. We're going to experiment against this. And all this takes time and effort. And that's where we face the J curve. So I would argue that quite often we need to make space, well, make time and give energy to that middle ground and to recognize that we're going to face the J curve and not be surprised by the J curve. And that sometimes the J curve tells us that we're on the right path, that we accept short-term inconvenience and short-term use of our time for longer-term benefits. Of course, one of the big ideas in engineering, and you've heard me say this before, one of the big ideas in engineering and in efficiency is to reduce waste. If we look at the two ends of this spectrum, I think we can say that each end is characterized by a particular kind of waste. If we are looking at the convenience end, then I think we get into a situation where the waste is these ineffective outputs. So if you're looking for convenience, and we'll again model the drive-through fast food, we minimize the inputs to the point where we get an error in the order like Katie always did, right? It was very different when she stood at the counter in one of these fast food places, but right, and I think we all recognize that. So that's kind of the waste in convenience terms. Right. Now, in hurry, the waste is this frantic task switching, and I talk about this a lot. This, this I'm so busy being busy that I can't think about it. And that's oftentimes when things get broken, when longer term ideas get ignored. And so that's the waste on that end. Identifying and removing waste is a core engineering process, but it's thoughtfully done. Waste does not automatically identify itself. So we have to take a look carefully and say, okay, which parts are wasted? And so if we're careful, if we keep the ratio the same, then we can identify, oh, I thought that was waste, but I was wrong because our output went down, quality or what have you on the output went down. And I think if we focus exclusively on convenience, or we get in this busy hurry state, and we start making adjustments to our process, then if we keep the ratio the same, it's an accident. And we're not engineering the solution. We're not thinking through the solution. So again, the J curve is there. Thinking about the J curve is inconvenient, or thinking about the J curve takes time. But if we want different results, then we can't be the extreme end of convenient is complacent. And we can't be the extreme end of busy as this hyper busy and no time to think about things. We have to recognize that this is going to take effort. Now, the good news is you might not have to, and probably don't have to, do it yourself. You have to do some of it. You have to accept the fact that change is going to be a challenging thing. But in the modern world, we can look around. In many cases, somebody else has already engineered a solution to your problem. And that, of course, requires research, which requires time and effort. But if you think that somebody else has solved your problem, then you can do some research, you can experiment with their solution, you can begin to test their solution. And I think we all do this naturally. Recently, I had a problem with my printer, and it was going to make me late for a meeting, and the usual, right? My technology broke. And so I got through to the meeting and got done what I needed to get done, and I hurry. And it happens to us. But then afterwards, we need to stop and think, okay, let me consider what happened and whether or not I need to make the investment in fixing it. And think about that long term, because it's going to be much more inconvenient to fix the problem than it's going to be to unplug and replug the computer or the printer every time I need to print something. So that longer term thinking. And it's not always the right thing to do. Sometimes we literally, the J curve is too expensive. We can't afford the investment, and I understand that. But I would say we can't afford to be really kind of lazy about that, if you will. But you might not have to do it yourself. And an example of that is, I think we all at this stage in our work life and in our culture, we all basically accept that Ford's way is a good solution. And in hindsight, we could even say, wow, it's really obvious in hindsight. Well, many things are obvious in hindsight. And of course, we do it that way. But we need to not ignore the fact that this was a very, very challenging thing to do, and that efficiency is not free, but it has to be earned and gained, and you have to do something to get it. And that's another example of this idea of the J curve. So, of course, we do it that way. And what we want to do is maybe advance a little bit on that hindsight notion, maybe to have a little bit more of the perseverance and stick-to-itiveness that Henry Ford had in the face of these other ideas. I mean, clearly he wasn't focused on convenience, and clearly he wasn't bogged down in short-term hurry. And it's easy to get into those mindsets. And he had people telling him, hey, this is the wrong thing to do. You can't, you'll never get through it. Yeah, but he did. And so, taking on that mindset, I think. So, well, we need to do research on engineering and how to have space to do that. I argue that Attention Compass will help you develop space in your world. Covey gave us a great tool with his 4-quadrant system. So this engineering is a quadrant 2 kind of task. It's important but not urgent. And so using these thought models, I think, will help us as we look for long-term solutions for greater productivity. And giving it the time that it takes to arrive at an engineered solution, being patient with that process. I said, I think Attention Compass will help. People will say, hey, I freed up 20% of my time by implementing Attention Compass. And I asked them, okay, well, what do you do with that time? About half of them say, oh, I produce more, I work more. I fill that time with additional work. And I then coach them to, hey, take some of this savings that you found and reinvest it in the rest of your process. Use some of this time savings to think further about what you're doing and how you're being productive and how you're organizing your tools and these different ideas. And that 20% greater efficiency that my clients are very proud of, I think, is mostly the elimination of waste, but some of it is also gaining efficiency in its pure sense of having a more efficient process in place. Again, I describe Attention Compass in episode 22 of this podcast, and I'll put a link in the show notes. Or if you're interested in talking about this more, you can reach out to me directly via email. It's larry@dobusywright.com. So let's take a couple of minutes. This has been a very thoughtful kind of an episode, and I think that's appropriate because I'm trying to present to you a different mindset. And the mindset is that both hurry and convenience are close enough cousins to efficiency that they can masquerade. And that true efficiency is effortful, takes time. There's easier things to do than engineer a new process. There's less frustrating things to do than engineer a new process. And with Henry Ford as our example, talking about frustration, I'm sure he went home some nights and just, vented his frustration with the system, with the other people in his world, and they just don't understand. They just don't get me. I mean, this is human nature. And, the key image to keep in mind, in my mind, as we look at Ford is this patience to work through the J curve and understanding that this, as an example, understanding that it's so easy to look back on that and go, well, of course, it was obvious, but that it took a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of sweat to get there. And if we want similar results, then we should probably look into that, making that effort and choosing to go through that sweat, if you will, of improving our process. And then finally, there's ways to shortcut that. And I would argue that Attention Compass is a good way to shortcut the whole process. I'm offering to you the sweat equity that I developed over 5 years of developing this system, and the, try and fail. And, that's one of the reasons why I'm proud of the work that I've done, is because it wasn't easy. And but anyway, so I'm offering you the benefit of that engineered solution. If you had a factory that didn't have an assembly line, you might go to Henry Ford and say, hey, why is my factory not running very well? And so, by the same token, you might be interested in understanding more about attention compass. So it's not just a sales pitch. It's, hey, let's have this mindset. Let's organize our attempts at improving our efficiency. Let's not get overly busy on the one hand where we don't have mental space for it, and let's not get complacent on the other hand, but to be willing to take a look. And you're listening to this podcast, so you're in good company because you're already making a space for the time and effort that it takes to get better. And just recognize that that's a natural part of the process. It's not unusual at all for the process to require some effort and some energy on the path to improve. So I hope that's encouraging to you. And I hope that this has been a different kind of mindset for you. I was really taken aback by the story of Henry Ford because it had simply just not occurred to me that, wow, that must have been a huge challenge to produce that system, and must have had a significant number of people going, man, you have lost, Henry, you have lost your mind over this thing. And so I hope you'll take some encouragement out of that as well. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.